Hey, Brian here with Hospitality Intervention, where we talk about hospitality items. You don't have to be in the business to learn about the business because you use this business all the time. And what are we to talk about today? Well, I'm trying to actually get a channel going that we open up discussion talking about hospitality customer service. What it is I do, my name is Brian Williamson, and I host and do a lot of seminars across the world working with hospitality venues, say hotels, resorts, restaurants, but also any customer service based business, such as even office structures to Delta Airlines to even grocery stores like Whole Foods and so on and so forth. Because customer service is everywhere we go for the most part. But in my travels, I always like to kind of observe things. I like to sit back and kind of observe how things are, especially across the world when I go to a new country to see how people interact and the way things are done. Well, I wanted to actually open this subject line. And again, please, I want you to start, maybe if you could, following me, because obviously the more I get on the following and likes, that I can get to a point where we start doing these as live chats. And I'll set a time every single week to where I'll do chats. We could get call-ins, anything like that, to kind of discuss about this action of customer service. And maybe we can share some good points to help you out. As I said, I'm a company that comes in and helps, train your team. And, I'd love to share some ideas of what I do, and maybe you can implement them, because not everybody can afford companies like ours to come in. Well, I'm going to kick it off with a subject that's going to be dear to many people, and they're going to either hate me or like me, but I'm going to make this very clear, and it's about tipping. Okay, tipping to me is the one thing that's absolutely changed drastically after the COVID days, but has also changed throughout the world as you travel. Now let's look at tipping in the sense of, well, what are the tipping options, like the areas where we tip? Well, first of all, you have tips that were done in the past based on the fact of your above and beyond service. So in other words, if you did something that was beyond what you were normally scheduled or basically job description to do, we would usually tip you in saying thank you for your actions and what you've done. And that tipping today stays in place, and I still think that that's something that we'll talk about here in the future. But then we get the tipping here in the United States versus international when it comes to actual restaurants and bars and resorts, is that you don't have gratuities always added to the bill. Now, if you're traveling on a cruise line, of course, you're going to have that, and if you travel in some resorts, they'll have that included as well. But here in the U.S., when a typical restaurant opens up, servers make below minimum wage. And to give you an idea, when I was in the 90s, I made $2.13 as a server. The minimum wage was $5.15 at the time. Now, when I got tipped, my tipping per hour needed to at least equal $5.15, or the company was held liable to making up the difference of that. Now, that never happened. Always, your tips would make up your wages. I mean, unless you didn't get any business walking in that day, it's going to happen. And I share that with people, and they say they can't believe that it was so low. Well, I mean, yes, now I believe sometimes people are hired off at like $5.15 probably already as their base wage, and then the tips make up the difference. But what to tip as a customer? Now, I'm going to take this from a side of a customer as well as a trainer and as well as somebody who's worked in the business and been a server or bartender. In the service industry, tipping should always at least be 15%. Okay, even if your service was terrible, you got to remember a lot of people behind the scenes often work in restaurants relying on the tips of the server at the end of the evening. For example, they'll tip what we call your server assist or your busser. They'll tip the food runner or the expo who works for the kitchen in the back. They'll tip the bartenders. All that kind of gets into a pool. So when you don't tip because you're angry at the server, you have to realize that there are other people that the server tips out, and that you're quite possibly punishing them for the server's actions. Now, one thing I would like to share is that hopefully if the service is anywhere good, you're leaving more than 15%, because today 15% is not the normal one. That was what I'm sharing with you, is when you have had a bad experience. I honestly have probably done that once in my life, because I had a terrible experience enough to see that. But nowadays it's pretty much 18 to 20%. And you say, well, which people should get that? Well, here's the dilemma here. If you're having a server service you at a table and they're doing a great, phenomenal job, and even going above and beyond, then you should be looking at the 20% or even higher, 22%. Okay, and of course, if you have extra money and you want to make somebody's day, you definitely can, because this industry is very tough, and so people try to feed their families off of being a server. Where in my case, back in the 90s, if you were a server, you were generally just doing it because you were a student, which I was, and you would work on the side for extra cash. Well, when you look at the fact of what we see now, 20%, 22%, that's to servers. Now you get to another position where we have the bartenders. Now, if you're going to sit at the bar and the bartender is going to service you like a server would, then yeah, you should stay in that same category. But I don't believe if you go up to the bar, like say at a nightclub, you order a drink and then you grab it and you walk away, that you should be looking at 20, 22%. I think that's where I go back to the first tips where I said, okay, I'm going to give you just a typical thank you tip type thing, which is $1 or $2. And that's sort of normal. I mean, of course, if you're in a nightclub and the guy's making a big show of it, then, tip accordingly. But for the most part, I think if a bartender pops a beer can or a beer bottle, and it nowadays is like $12, I definitely don't think you should be giving them the 20% of that. I would just give them $1. And what gets me, though, is those who are in this business, how you feel about that. Listen, you have to realize that that customer is deciding to come into your location, and if they did not come into your location, then they weren't buying that product from you, and therefore they went to somebody else. If you run it off of the fact that they don't tip you, and that's what upsets you, then I got news for you. You should really be looking at the fact that they came in and they used your services. And as a restaurant owner, you definitely need that, because you're making your profit margins off of what you're selling, which is the product, the food. The tips, to me, is one of those areas where I don't believe that it's necessary to do that unless you're seeing like the bartender go above and beyond. And then, if you got the extra cash, then please do. But understand that bartenders will be paid more than servers for the most part. And they have more interaction with customers and guests. So you got to remember, every time, like in a nightclub, they're going up there and ordering a drink. They're doing it. I mean, they'll make a drink every 5 seconds. Okay, so they're going to get a lot of tips. They get a lot more volume tips than they get actual, the value of the tip, basically. So that gives you another idea. Now, the other one I'd like to kind of talk about is what we've seen has changed drastically over COVID is takeout service. Now, most restaurants for takeout will probably use the bartender, especially during the day for lunches. But let's just say you have a takeout service, say down here, I'm in Clearwater area, we've got Hooters. All right, so Hooters has a whole section for takeouts. You go directly over to that takeout section. I want you to understand that takeout session, the person behind there is most likely a greeter, hostess, or a supervisor or manager, believe it or not. They're not going to be the veteran servers. Now, what they generally do is they'll take your order possibly, and they go in the back and they grab a bag and they bring that bag out to you, and that's it. So now I ask you, do you think that that's worth 20% to do that? Do you think that they should be getting tipped the same amount as a server who served 45 to 2 hours at your table? All they did was go in the back and grab it from the expo or the food run. They're the ones who actually did something for you, but to be honest with you, all they did was what their job was, which is to make my food and to put it in a container. We seem to forget about the fact that obviously food prices have gone up drastically, that if I choose to go to your establishment, then I'm doing you a favor, period. So if you look at me because I didn't tip you, that's a sad occurrence. And I see that a lot more these days, especially when we think about places like Moe's and Subway. Why am I tipping at freaking Subway? When did this become a thing to where I tip you for making my sandwich, which is what your job is? And we see this more and more. If you do the apps, constantly, it already highlights it down there and says, what percentage tip would you like to spend? I don't agree with this. If somebody's doing above and beyond, you want to put extra bacon on there for me, okay, maybe we'll talk. But if you're just talking about your job is to make the sandwich, because now I'm going to say this. What about the people at McDonald's, Burger King, Taco Bell? Now we're going to see tip jars out in front of those? No, because those companies don't allow that. So I actually say this to Subway, shame on you. You need to start controlling some people, because when that happens, you start to make people feel obligated that they need the tip. And if you're a Subway owner, you just want business. You want people to come in there. And so if something is deterring them from coming in and people don't feel comfortable in coming in because they don't want to tip, but they don't want your employees staring them down, that's a problem. So it's something to think about in the future when you do this. But now we talk about the takeout services such as Uber and Grubhub and all these places that I've seen these videos that are out there where people take a picture of, say, the rack that the restaurant has it on for orders, and they say, okay, you see all these orders over here? They're not picked up because there's no tips. Please, for the sake of understanding this, whenever you use these food facilities services, don't tip them in the beginning. You don't have to. These things can do this afterwards to where you give tips. I encourage you to not tip people before the food gets to you. And if they have a problem with that, then they need to switch jobs, because that's ridiculous that you're going to go out there and tip these people for a service you don't know what they gave you. What happens if they're late? What happens if the food's cold? What if they spilled the thing and it fell on the ground and they picked it up? There's a big problem. You already tipped them when they've got problems. So when I sit there and I see people get angry because the fact that you're not tipped up front, I'm angry at you. Stop asking it. I would never tip. I generally never tip before. I will always wait for you to deliver the food and I see the service that you gave me. Now here's something I want you to understand too. That service that you're paying is paying you. They're paying for you to drive your car there. Now in the days, really in the 90s and 80s, we the only people who delivered food to you were usually pizza places and Chinese food sometimes. And I can tell you right now, people didn't give you 20% based on what the price of the ticket was. Now here's something I want you to understand on this, to think about it. If that person were to get a percentage of what your food cost, I want you to think about this. Is there any difference to the Uber driver or a delivery driver who goes into, say, a Outback Steakhouse and grabs your meal that costs you around $50 or so, versus them going to McDonald's and grabbing you an order that costs $10? Now, what is the driver doing that's different from the Outback Steakhouse versus the McDonald's? Nothing. And yet you're looking at this by tipping them on the percentage of the cost of the food. I'm telling you right now, that's not what I would be doing. You need to tip them afterwards, and you need them to give a good tip, obviously based on delivering the food, but sometimes it's not going to be the value of that. And where I get really disgusted is when people seem to think that that's what I'm going to give you when you deliver my groceries. Are you kidding me? Today's groceries is impossible to not sit there and have a few meals that's over $300. I'm going to tip you 20% of $300? No, I'm not. All right? You're getting a service that you're getting paid for. That tips is extra. Tips is based on what you've done extra. And I would say into that category of the drivers, you should be tipping based on the fact of the service that they gave you. If it's lousy service, then just give them a little few dollars. Because I'm sorry, you were late. You did not carry the food correctly. That's your job. And you have to take responsibility for that. I shouldn't just tip you automatically. So I will say this, when I see these videos, it bothers me when you're sitting there saying, I'm not going to pick up those orders because there's no tip. They should tip you afterwards. And a lot of people do. So if you're ordering from these apps, please, for the sake of the rest of us who use these apps, tip afterwards. Leave them some money. You want to give them cash, I guarantee you they'll take cash over anything, because that's even better for them. But now we get back to another tipping thing that I'll share with you is outside of food and beverage, what to tip for, things. If you notice, the cost of things have just obviously gone through the roof with this administration. But if you were to look at, say, a haircut, when I used to get a haircut, it was around $7 in the 90s. Now it's $16 or $11 or $12, something like that. Does that warrant yourself to giving 20% or things along those lines? I, honest to God, I look at that one and I say whether or not the person was actually interacting or doing a good job. And some of us, for the guys, that we've gone into these super cuts and great clips, and the person did our hair in 5 minutes, didn't even care to talk to us, and probably did a mediocre job. Is that really worth 20%? No, it's not. And I don't encourage you to do that. I think when it comes to services such as like hair cutting, if you're a good tipper, they're probably going to do a better job. So it's something to use your own, your own belief in what you want to believe on that when you go to the store. Feel them out and say, okay, this person, Dave gives me a very good haircut. He spends 15-20 minutes. We talk about things, and it's great advice. Well, okay, yeah, I'll give you a good tip. But if I'm going to go in there and Mary's cutting my hair and she just quickly goes over with the clippers, doesn't say anything, and next thing you know, I'm done in 5 minutes, that's a little different. When we get into tipping on other places, like where gratuity is already added, what about this? Well, that would be like cruise liners or resorts where you get packages. I recently just went on my first cruise with my wife, and I have to tell you that the only thing that made the trip feel uncomfortable was the fact that everything you did, you felt like you needed the tip. And what kind of got me was that was included in all these packages. Every time you went to the dining facilities, you were charged. Even if you didn't go to the dining facilities, they still charged you, because that's how they do it on those boats. So the gratuity was taken out. And sometimes it's quite high. It's already 22% oftentimes. A lot of times it's 18%. But what I didn't like was the fact that, you sit there and you get a housekeeper and they stick that envelope in your room, and then, tips go a long way. Servers carry these empty envelopes and they do that. The good thing is a lot of times you didn't get those until the end of the trip, which, okay, I felt better about that versus every single day trying to leave the housekeeper money or things like that. I don't think was worth it. Now, you say to yourself, well, that's unfair. These people deserve more, and so on and so forth. Well, I'm going to tell you, since COVID, the services of restaurants and takeout have gone tremendously a lot higher than what they were. You have more places doing deliveries of food, so you have more tipping basically going on in this country than what you used to have. And oh, by the way, to let you know, when you do international, they don't tip as much. To give you an example, if I go to Paris, you'll sit there and have a dinner that says 98 euro, you leave €2. All right, now it's hard for you to imagine that, but that's actually because their food is already included a percentage to, not so much of a tip, but it's more of like you're selling that item. They're salespeople, so they're going to get a percentage of that. That's why a lot of times when people who are in this business, obviously, when an international person comes in, they don't understand that, and that's why sometimes you're seeing the tips actually put at the bottom, because people over there and internationally need to know that service you have to take care of. You have to give that, and they separate that versus other places include that to the food. So within that, I just felt like sharing that a little bit about tipping. I know that in this world we're all going to be a little bit different. You want to leave more money, and I still think the people who do that and make those miracle videos and they give these servers extra money, I mean, they could use it. But I am also saying that we need to also prevent some of this so we're not spoiling people, because I have to say I have had an Uber driver drop me off in San Francisco, and because the traffic took so long, the bill was over $100, and that person is expecting me to tip them 20% of my cab ride. No, I'm not doing that. I'm sorry, you're getting paid a good amount of money to do that cab ride. I'm not going to sit there and start throwing these extra tips because the price went up. I don't agree with that. I'm paying the price. You're getting more money because I'm in here for that reason. Especially when you go in different time zones where they switch the rates. I don't agree with that sometimes. Now, when you get to other services handing $1-2 for like a bag person who takes your bags up at Bellman, or an airport courier pipe person, yeah, that always goes a long way. But I just still don't think that should be a percentage thing. So it's something to think about. I'm curious. So if we could get some likes and follows on this, I'd really like to get this open conversation to where we can kind of share some great ideas and great tips. And again, like I said, I still do trainings. I'm actually leaving next week to do trainings in New York. And I'd love to share what I hear from other people, as well as we can talk about subject lines that can even help your restaurant if you're business owners. So again, name is Brian Williamson, here with Hospitality Intervention.